My daughter-in-law turned love into a competition. My grandson whispered to me one rainy afternoon, and at the time, I thought he was simply repeating something he didn't fully understand. I wish he had been. Looking back now, those words were the first crack in a carefully polished picture I had spent years believing was real. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, a widow, a retired elementary school teacher, and until recently, I believed family was the one thing in life that could not be measured, compared, or won. I was wrong. The trouble began on a gray October morning, 3 weeks after my son William's memorial service. The house felt quieter than ever. The grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder somehow, each tick stretching through rooms that had once been filled with laughter. I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. Across from me was the empty chair where William used to sit whenever he visited. Even after all those weeks, I still caught myself glancing toward it. Grief does strange things. It tricks you into expecting people who are never coming back. That morning, Olivia arrived without calling first. She walked into my house carrying a designer handbag and wearing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Margaret," she said brightly, setting a stack of folders on the table. "I thought it would be helpful if we started organizing things." Organizing things. Such harmless words. I nodded and invited her to sit down. She began sorting papers immediately. Insurance documents, utility statements, tax records, everything William and I had once discussed together during Sunday dinners. I watched her hands move quickly across the table. She seemed unusually comfortable, more comfortable than someone still mourning her husband should have been. At first, I told myself not to judge. People grieve differently. That's what I repeated in my mind. But then I noticed something strange. Every conversation somehow became a comparison. If I mentioned William had loved my homemade apple pie, Olivia would smile and say he preferred hers during the last few years. If I recalled a childhood memory, she would respond with a story proving she knew him better. If someone complimented the way I had supported my son throughout his life, Olivia found a way to remind everyone how much she had sacrificed for him as his wife. It was subtle, so subtle that nobody else seemed to notice. But I did. Love was no longer love in Olivia's world. It was a contest. Every memory had a score. Every act of kindness had a winner. Every expression of grief became an opportunity to prove she mattered more. Then came the moment I couldn't ignore. Olivia opened one of the folders and casually said, "William always told me I was the most important person in his life." Her tone was light, almost cheerful. I looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen suddenly felt colder. "I'm sure he loved you very much," I replied quietly. "He did," she said, "more than anyone." The words hung between us. She smiled again and looked down at her paperwork. But something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Just awareness. Because that statement wasn't about love. It wasn't even about William. It was about winning. For the first time, I realized Olivia wasn't trying to honor my son's memory. She was trying to own it. Later that evening, after she left, I walked through the house turning off lights room by room. When I reached the family room, I stopped in front of a framed photograph. William stood between Olivia and me, smiling with his arms around both of us. Looking at that picture, I suddenly understood something that had been hiding in plain sight for years. This competition hadn't started after William died. It had started long before, and I had been losing without even realizing there was a game. The days that followed were quiet in a way that made the house feel larger and emptier than it had ever been. Every morning, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the maple trees shed their leaves across the yard, the wind carrying them down the street. The silence reminded me of the absence that had grown heavier than grief itself. Meals were prepared, set, and eaten alone, each clink of a fork against a plate echoing in the stillness. I noticed the smallest details, the way the curtains swayed, the way the sunlight shifted on the oak floor, and how the photographs on the wall seemed to stare back at me with muted accusation. It was during these quiet hours that I began to replay every interaction I had witnessed over the last few years, connecting patterns that had seemed innocuous at the time, but now glimmered with intention. I remembered birthday parties when William had appeared distant, always apologizing for being late, often diverted by Olivia's suggestions on how to arrange the tables or entertain the children. I recalled holidays where she insisted on creating new traditions, not malicious in her voice, yet with subtle exclusion woven into every activity. I recalled casual remarks she made about financial responsibilities, gently steering discussions toward decisions that favored her control. At first, I questioned myself, wondering if I was imagining motives where none existed, but the clarity that had escaped me in the midst of loss settled into undeniable truth now. Olivia had been shaping the household quietly, turning love into comparison, attention into accolades for herself, and any act of mine into a benchmark she could surpass. One evening, Emily came to sit with me after school. Her face was flushed from the cold outside, and she held a folded piece of paper in her small hands. "Grandma," she said softly, "I saw something on Mommy's phone about Dad and the house. I think she is hiding things." I took the paper, my fingers brushing hers, and my heart thumped with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. The evidence was subtle but irrefutable. Emails and notes with plans that omitted me, reminders to William that painted me as overbearing, and documents that had quietly shifted ownership language in ways that favored Olivia. As I set the paper down, I realized that knowledge itself became a tool. Quietly, deliberately, I began to consider each step I would take, not in haste, not in anger, but with measured precision. I observed Olivia's patterns, noting how she positioned herself during family visits, the timing of her calls to William, even her tone in conversation when discussing the estate. Every word, every gesture seemed calculated, yet predictable in its repetitiveness. In the evenings, I took to walking through the house, touching the surfaces, rearranging small items, as if rehearsing the rhythm of control I once held naturally. The scent of William's old study reminded me of afternoons spent with him, laughing over papers and homework, planning family vacations, and talking through life. That study had been invaded subtly, papers relocated, files mislabeled. These were not accidents. They were steps in a long game that had been played around me, never against me directly, but always at my expense. I made no confrontations, said no accusations, allowed no emotion to cloud my observations. Each day, I cataloged, remembered, and understood. Each night, I imagined the moves I could make, the quiet power of evidence over impulse, the meticulous planning that could restore the balance without the spectacle of anger or humiliation. And through it all, Emily watched and learned the weight of observation, the strength of patience, and the way a house, a family, and even love itself could be preserved, reclaimed, and honored with careful attention, strategy, and the silent force of dignity. The following Saturday, Olivia invited the family to her house for dinner. It was the first gathering since the memorial service, and although she described it as a simple evening together, I sensed there was a purpose behind it. The moment I walked through the front door, I noticed changes. William's photographs had been rearranged. Frames that once displayed moments from his childhood now sat on lower shelves, while newer pictures featuring Olivia occupied the most visible places in the room. It was a small detail. Perhaps nobody else would have thought twice about it. But I did. People reveal themselves through small decisions. During dinner, Olivia seemed unusually cheerful. She laughed often, poured drinks for everyone, and told stories that always placed her at the center. I watched quietly from the far end of the table. Emily sat beside me, occasionally glancing in my direction as if making sure I noticed the same things she did. Halfway through the meal, Olivia brought up a charity event that William had supported years ago. She smiled and explained how much he had relied on her advice while making decisions. Then she casually added that she had always been the person who understood him best. The conversation continued, but something changed in the room. Several relatives exchanged brief looks before returning their attention to their plates. Even they seemed uncomfortable. Love should not require witnesses. Understanding should not need constant advertisement. Yet Olivia spoke as though every memory required validation, as though she needed to win a contest nobody else was participating in. Later that evening, while helping clear dishes, I overheard a conversation in the kitchen. Olivia was speaking with her friend Melissa. They did not realize I was standing in the hallway. "Margaret still thinks people see her as the heart of the family," Olivia said softly. "But things change. People move on." Melissa laughed lightly. "Well, you are the one holding everything together now." Olivia sounded pleased by the comment. "Exactly." I stepped away before they could see me. Not because I felt hurt. That feeling had already faded. What remained was clarity. For years, I had assumed Olivia wanted acceptance. Now I understood she wanted recognition. More specifically, she wanted comparison. She needed every relationship measured against her own, every memory ranked, every affection evaluated. The realization followed me home that night. I sat alone in William's study and opened an old wooden box where he kept letters, cards, and family photographs. For nearly 2 hours, I sorted through memories. Birthday cards from elementary school, handwritten notes from college, photographs from camping trips and Christmas mornings. There was something remarkable about those keepsakes. None of them were competitions. None of them recorded who mattered most. They simply captured moments of love. Toward the bottom of the box, I found a folder I had not seen before. Inside were documents related to the family trust. Most were routine records. Then I noticed several recent additions. The dates immediately caught my attention. Some changes had been proposed only months before William passed away. Proposed by Olivia. I read every page carefully. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. But each revision shifted influence a little further toward her control. One adjustment here, another there. Standing alone, each change appeared harmless. Together, they painted a picture. For the first time, I could see the strategy. Olivia had been building her position piece by piece for years. Not through confrontation, through patience, through perception, through the gradual reshaping of family dynamics until everyone accepted her version of reality. I closed the folder and placed it back inside the box. Then I looked around the study. The room felt different now. Not sad, not lonely, focused. Because for the first time since William was gone, I stopped looking backward. I started looking ahead. And the more I learned, the more certain I became that Olivia believed the game was already over. She had no idea I had finally started paying attention. Over the next week, I said very little about what I had discovered. That surprised Olivia. I could see it in the way she studied my face whenever we spoke. People often expect resistance when they are pushing boundaries. Silence makes them uncomfortable because they cannot measure it. One Tuesday afternoon, Olivia stopped by unexpectedly carrying a folder and a bright smile. She placed the folder on my dining room table and began discussing plans for the upcoming holiday season. According to her, several family traditions needed updating. Certain gatherings would be moved to her house. New schedules would be created. Different guest lists would be considered. She spoke confidently, as though decisions had already been made. I listened quietly and stirred my tea. Years ago, I would have voiced my concerns immediately. Now I simply observed. The more she spoke, the more obvious the pattern became. Every suggestion positioned her closer to the center of family life. Every change reduced someone else's role. Mine most of all. After she left, I sat alone by the window and found myself remembering a Christmas nearly 8 years earlier. William had spent an entire afternoon helping me decorate the tree. We laughed when the old angel topper nearly fell from the ladder. Later that evening, Olivia arrived and jokingly told everyone that William only helped because she reminded him. At the time, I laughed along with the rest of the family. Now I realized that moment was not unique. It was one of hundreds. Small comments, tiny corrections, subtle revisions of reality, always shifting attention, always adjusting credit, always competing where no competition existed. The following day, I met my longtime friend Henry for lunch at a small diner 2 miles from my neighborhood. Henry had known William since he was a teenager. More importantly, he had spent 40 years working in finance and estate planning. We talked about ordinary things at first. The weather, retirement, community events. Then I asked a few careful questions about trust documents and family assets. Henry listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands and looked at me thoughtfully. "Margaret," he said, "sometimes people reveal their priorities by what they try to control." I nodded slowly. "And sometimes," he continued, "they reveal even more by what they think nobody is paying attention to." Those words stayed with me long after lunch ended. That evening, I returned home and reviewed every document again. This time I noticed something I had overlooked. Several recommendations Olivia had pushed over the years involved the same attorney, the same financial advisor, the same circle of professional contacts. Nothing improper, nothing illegal, yet the consistency caught my attention. She had spent years building influence through relationships while everyone else assumed she was simply being helpful. For the first time, I appreciated the patience behind her strategy. Unfortunately for Olivia, Patience was something I understood very well. I had spent 35 years teaching elementary school children. I had raised a son. I had cared for aging parents. I had supported my husband through difficult times. Patience was not weakness. It was endurance. And endurance often outlasted ambition. 3 days later, Emily visited after school carrying her backpack and a worried expression. We baked chocolate chip cookies together while she talked about classes and friends. Eventually, she grew quiet. "Grandma," she asked softly, "do you ever feel like people are trying too hard to prove something?" I looked at her carefully. "Sometimes," I replied. "Why?" Emily hesitated before answering. "Because Mommy always acts like she has to win conversations about Dad." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. I reached for a cookie tray and set it on the counter. "And how does that make you feel?" I asked. Emily stared at the floor. "Like nobody gets to just miss him." Her answer stayed with me long after she left. Because in one simple sentence, my granddaughter had identified the truth I had been struggling to describe. Grief had become a scoreboard for Olivia. Memories had become trophies. And somewhere along the way, she had forgotten that love was never supposed to have a winner. The following week brought an opportunity one had not expected. Every year, our family hosted a Thanksgiving planning dinner several weeks before the holiday itself. For decades, the gathering had been simple. We discussed recipes, guest lists, decorations, and who would bring what. It was never complicated. Yet when Olivia sent out invitations this year, she included something new. An agenda. That single detail made me smile. Families do not usually require agendas. Organizations do. The dinner was held at her house on a chilly Thursday evening. As relatives arrived, I noticed Olivia moving through the room with practiced confidence. She greeted everyone warmly, directed conversations, assigned seats, and made sure she remained at the center of every discussion. Watching her felt like watching someone perform a role she had rehearsed for years. The remarkable part was how few people seemed to notice. They simply accepted the version of reality she presented. During dinner, she unveiled several plans for the holiday season. New traditions, new schedules, new responsibilities. Every proposal seemed reasonable until viewed as part of a larger pattern. Piece by piece, she was positioning herself as the person everyone needed approval from. At one point, she pulled out a binder and began assigning hosting duties. "I think it will make everything more efficient," she explained. Several relatives nodded. Then she reached my name. "Margaret," she said with a pleasant smile, "you have done so much over the years. Maybe this is the perfect time to relax and let the younger generation take over." The room grew quiet. Most people probably heard kindness in those words. I heard replacement. There was a difference. I folded my napkin carefully and smiled. "That is very thoughtful," I replied. Although I have always believed traditions belong to everyone, not just whoever happens to be organizing them. The response was gentle. Yet I noticed something interesting. Olivia's smile tightened for less than a second. Barely noticeable. Then it returned. The conversation moved on. Later that evening, Emily found me standing alone on the back patio. The air was cold enough to make small clouds appear with every breath. She stepped beside me and looked toward the yard. "You surprised her," she said quietly. "Did I?" I asked. Emily nodded. She thought you would agree immediately. Children often notice truths adults ignore. I rested my hand on her shoulder and smiled. Sometimes people become too confident in their assumptions. Emily looked thoughtful. "Grandma, do you have a plan?" I stared across the dark lawn where the porch lights cast long shadows. "I have patience," I answered. "That is different." The next morning, Henry called. He had spent several days reviewing information I asked him to examine. Nothing official, nothing intrusive, just observations from years of experience. What he told me confirmed what I already suspected. Olivia had built influence carefully, gradually, and strategically. Her greatest advantage was not intelligence or determination. It was the fact that nobody questioned her intentions. People assumed she was helping because she always appeared helpful. They assumed she was protecting the family because she spoke the language of protection. But influence built on perception can become fragile once people start paying attention. After our conversation ended, I sat quietly in William's study. Sunlight filtered through the windows and illuminated the old family photographs lined across the shelves. For a long time, I simply looked at them. Then I noticed something I had never considered before. Every photograph represented a memory. Every memory represented a story. And for years, Olivia had been rewriting those stories one conversation at a time. The difference now was that I could finally see it happening. More importantly, I was no longer the only one. Emily saw it. Henry saw it. Even some relatives were beginning to sense the imbalance. Olivia believed she was strengthening her position. In reality, she was becoming predictable. And the more predictable she became, the easier it would be to reveal the truth without ever raising my voice. The following afternoon, I began to put a plan into motion. Not a plan born of anger or urgency, but one of observation and careful preparation. I reviewed every conversation I had with Olivia over the past several years, every interaction at family gatherings, every note left on the refrigerator, every subtle correction to a family story that had once seemed innocent. Patterns emerged. Every comment she made, every smile she directed, every suggestion she offered was designed to elevate her position while minimizing the contributions of others. I began documenting these moments quietly, writing down dates, phrases, and reactions. Nothing aggressive, nothing inflammatory. Just the facts. Later that week, Emily and I sat together at the kitchen table with a stack of family photographs, letters, and notes that William had left behind. I asked her to help me organize them chronologically, not for display, but for clarity. She placed each photograph carefully on the table, aligning them with letters and notes, pointing out moments that demonstrated William's kindness, his love for family, and the ordinary acts of generosity that were never about competition. Her small voice brought a fresh perspective, reminding me that some truths are evident to those with clarity and innocence. At night, I walked through the house, turning off lights, opening drawers, and taking note of the spaces Olivia favored, the areas she had claimed subtly over the years. I made no changes. I only observed. Each room became a record of intention and influence. By the end of the week, I had accumulated a clear picture of the dynamics at play, understanding not only what Olivia had done, but how predictable her patterns were. The next morning, I called Henry. He had spent the past few days cross-referencing documents and providing insight into financial and administrative shifts that had gone unnoticed by the rest of the family. Together, we identified minor adjustments and opportunities where a simple correction could restore balance without confrontation. Knowledge gave me leverage. By midweek, I arranged a small gathering at my home under the guise of a routine lunch with Emily and a few family friends. Olivia was invited, as always, to maintain appearances. During the meal, I kept conversation light, occasionally asking questions that encouraged reflection rather than defense. Subtle observations were made in front of her. Compliments were given to others for contributions she had previously minimized. She responded as usual, smiling, correcting, sharing stories, but never realizing the undercurrent. I allowed her to take center stage, knowing each move she made revealed more about her strategy and her reliance on assumptions. Alone later, I reviewed every note, every photograph, every detail I had collected over the past days. I realized that patience and awareness had become tools of quiet power. The smallest detail, an overlooked comment, a misaligned photograph, a subtle correction to a story, became the foundation for restoring the balance of family memory and influence. For the first time, I felt confident not in confrontation, but in observation, documentation, and precision. The house, the family, the memories, they were not lost. They were waiting for clarity and care, for the moment when understanding would finally restore what had quietly been taken away. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, an unexpected opportunity arrived. Olivia called and asked if I would help assemble a family memory presentation for the holiday gathering. Her voice sounded cheerful, almost excited. According to her, everyone would contribute photographs and stories celebrating family history. I agreed immediately. The irony was impossible to ignore. For years, she had quietly reshaped family narratives. Now she was inviting me to help document them. As soon as the call ended, I sat at my dining room table and stared at the notebook that had become my companion over the previous weeks. Page after page contained observations, dates, conversations, and details. None of it was dramatic. None of it was scandalous. Yet together, the notes revealed something powerful. They showed a pattern. More importantly, they showed the difference between genuine love and carefully managed perception. During the following days, family members began sending photographs for the presentation. Emily helped me organize them. We spent hours sorting old pictures across my living room floor. William as a little boy holding a fishing pole nearly twice his height. William helping his grandfather paint a fence. William standing proudly beside a science fair project. Looking through those photographs felt different now. For the first time in months, I was not overwhelmed by grief. Instead, I felt connected to the truth of who my son had been. He had never measured people against one another. He had never treated relationships like competitions. He valued loyalty, kindness, and patience. The more photographs I reviewed, the more obvious that became. Then something unexpected happened. Emily found a small envelope tucked inside an old photo album. Inside was a handwritten letter from William written several years earlier. It was addressed to no one in particular, more of a reflection than a letter. In it, he wrote about family gatherings, traditions, and the importance of making sure everyone felt valued. One sentence stopped me cold. The best thing about our family is that nobody has to earn their place. They already belong. I read those words 3 times. Then I carefully folded the letter and placed it beside the photographs. Later that week, Olivia invited several relatives to her house to review the presentation. I attended quietly. As expected, she positioned herself as the coordinator of everything. She directed discussions, approved image selections, and suggested which stories should be included. At one point, she removed a photograph of William and me from a camping trip years ago. It does not really fit the theme, she explained. A few minutes later, she added 3 separate photographs featuring herself. Nobody challenged the decision. Nobody except Emily. Grandma should be in more pictures, she said casually. The room became very quiet. Olivia laughed lightly and changed the subject, but I noticed several relatives exchange glances. Tiny moments matter. They accumulate. They reveal what words often hide. Driving home that evening, I realized something important had changed. For months, Olivia had operated under a simple assumption. She believed people only saw what she showed them. But now others were beginning to notice the gaps between her words and her actions. They were starting to ask questions. Not because I had accused her of anything. Not because I had exposed her. Simply because patterns become difficult to ignore once they are visible. That night, I sat alone in William's study and looked at the letter again. His handwriting seemed almost alive beneath the lamplight. Nobody has to earn their place. Such a simple sentence. Yet it exposed the entire problem. Some people build families through connection. Others try to build status within them. For the first time, I felt certain that the truth would reveal itself soon. And when it did, I would not need to force it. I would simply allow everyone else to see what had been there all along. Thanksgiving arrived beneath a clear autumn sky. The morning air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and for the first time in months, I felt completely calm. Not because my grief had disappeared, not because the family had suddenly healed. I felt calm because uncertainty was gone. I finally understood what had been happening, and more importantly, I understood what needed to happen next. By noon, relatives began arriving at Olivia's house carrying casseroles, pies, and serving dishes. Laughter filled the rooms. Children ran through the hallways. Football played quietly on a television in the den. On the surface, everything looked exactly the way Thanksgiving should look. Olivia moved confidently through the house, greeting guests and directing preparations. She wore the expression of someone who believed the day belonged to her. In many ways, she believed the family belonged to her as well. The memory presentation was scheduled after dinner. Weeks earlier, Olivia had insisted it would be the perfect way to honor William's memory. Everyone agreed. As the meal ended and dessert plates were cleared away, family members gathered in the living room. Chairs were arranged in rows. Lights were dimmed. A large screen stood at the front of the room. Olivia stepped forward with a smile. She thanked everyone for coming and spoke about family, tradition, and moving forward together. Her words were polished, practiced, familiar. Then the presentation began. The first photographs appeared exactly as expected. Childhood memories, school events, vacations, holidays, family gatherings. People smiled and occasionally laughed as stories were shared. Olivia narrated many of the images, often placing herself near the center of each memory. I simply listened. About halfway through the presentation, Emily stood up unexpectedly. Several heads turned toward her. She looked nervous, but determined. "Before we finish," she said, "I found something I think Dad would have wanted everyone to hear." The room fell silent. Olivia looked surprised. Emily walked toward the screen holding William's handwritten letter. She glanced at me briefly before beginning to read. Her voice trembled at first, then grew stronger with each sentence. The words filled the room. William wrote about gratitude, about family traditions, about kindness, about making sure nobody felt forgotten. Then Emily reached the sentence that changed everything. The best thing about our family is that nobody has to earn their place. They already belong. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Reflective silence. The kind that forces people to think. I watched faces throughout the room. Some relatives looked down. Others exchanged glances. A few quietly nodded. Nobody spoke. They did not need to. The contrast had become visible on its own. Olivia attempted a smile. She thanked Emily and suggested continuing the presentation. But something had shifted. People were no longer focused on her narration. They were thinking about William's words. They were remembering their own experiences. They were comparing what they had heard with what they had witnessed over the years. The remaining photographs played across the screen, yet the atmosphere had changed completely. For the rest of the evening, relatives approached one another sharing stories that had nothing to do with status, recognition, or influence. They spoke about simple acts of kindness, shared memories, moments of support. The family felt different, lighter, more genuine. As guests prepared to leave, several relatives stopped to hug me. Others spent extra time talking with Emily. Nobody ignored Olivia. Nobody confronted her. Something far more powerful had happened. People had begun seeing clearly. Later that night, as I gathered my coat, Olivia approached me near the front door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked quietly, "Did you know Emily was going to read that letter?" I looked at her calmly. I knew William's words deserved to be heard. Her expression tightened slightly before she nodded. No argument followed. No accusation. None was necessary. Because for the first time since William passed away, the conversation was no longer centered on who mattered most. It was centered on what mattered most. And that was a competition Olivia could never win. The evening after Thanksgiving, the house was quiet again. Guests had gone home, the lights were dimmed, and only the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the kitchen. I stood near the window, gazing out at the frost glistening on the front lawn, and I reflected on the days that had passed. Each step in this journey had been deliberate, measured, and silent. Olivia had assumed her influence was secure, her control unquestioned. She had not anticipated patience, observation, and careful attention. I walked through the house, moving slowly from room to room, noting the subtle shifts in atmosphere. Each room contained its own story. The living room with its photographs, the dining room with its neatly arranged table, the study with William's letters and records. Each object, each detail, was a witness to history, to truth, and to the moments that mattered most. That night, Emily came to sit with me, carrying her homework and a small notebook filled with sketches and observations. We talked quietly about school, friends, and shared stories of our family. Then she asked, "Grandma, will things always be this complicated with Olivia?" I shook my head slowly. "No, Emily. Complication fades when people see clearly, when actions are visible, and when truth is allowed to speak for itself." She looked at me thoughtfully, her small hands folded on the table. "So it is about waiting?" she asked. "Not exactly waiting," I replied. "It is about observing, understanding, and acting with care. Patience is not the absence of action. It is the assurance that when the moment is right, truth will be recognized without conflict." Later, I placed William's letter back into its envelope and set it carefully on the shelf. Its presence was a reminder that the core of family is not control, recognition, or competition. It is connection, love, and remembrance. Olivia's presence in the house remained constant, yet something fundamental had changed. Her assumptions about influence no longer held the weight they once did. Subtle comments, gestures, and control mechanisms were now visible, interpreted by those who had watched carefully. The family had begun to see patterns, distinctions, and the reality of genuine care versus orchestrated attention. That clarity shifted the balance. Without confrontation, without argument, the family narrative began to align more closely with the truth of William's life and values. I moved through the home one final time that night, closing blinds, turning off lights, and pausing briefly in the study. I breathed in deeply, absorbing the stillness. For the first time since William's passing, the house felt whole again. Not because nothing had happened, but because understanding, patience, and quiet observation had restored the sense of belonging that could not be taken away. Olivia had played her part, but the impact of truth and love was stronger. I sat in William's chair, looking at the framed photographs on the wall, and realized that dignity, patience, and clarity had quietly reclaimed the family space, ensuring that love, in its truest form, remained unchallenged and unmeasured.